So I'm going to do the official introduction. Welcome everybody to the Boswell Book Company virtual event series. I'm Daniel Goldin, the proprietor of Boswell. It is day 4,424 of us being in business. We are so honored to be hosting Kirstin Valdez Quade, author of The Five Wounds. She was the John Leonard Prize winner for A Night at the Fiesta. She is the recipient of a 5 Under 35 award from the National Book Foundation, the Rome Prize, and the Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award. Her work has appeared in the New York Times Best American Short Stories and the O. Henry Prize Stories. She teaches at Princeton. And Five Wounds is one of our favorite books of fall. I'm gonna give a shout out to one of my booksellers who is on vacation and watching this from her cabin. Thank you, Jen, for telling me how much you love The Five Wounds. It got me to read it, and it's definitely going to be in one of my top books for the year. We are so honored. After I read this book, I knew exactly who I was going to ask to do the conversation, and we are so grateful that she agreed. Jennifer Morales is a Wisconsin-based author and performance artist, among other things. She is a former bookseller. She holds an MFA in creative writing from Antioch University, and her writing has appeared in Milwaukee Noir and Cutting Edge. Her latest book is Meet Me Halfway, which is the current selection of the Larry Mueller Wisconsin Public Radio Book Club, which they'll be discussing in June. And we are a proud sponsor, very proud. So thank you both so much for coming tonight. Virtual clapping. Welcome to Boswell's Virtual Event Series.
Thank you so much, Daniel. What a treat to be here. And thank you for all those kind words. And I'm so happy to meet you, Jennifer. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, I'm excited. This literally is one of the best books I've read in several years, and I just feel like so honored to be here as well.
Oh, thank you.
So we were going to have a conversation, but before that, I wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe introduce the book and read us a few pages.
Sure. So my novel, The Five Wounds, is set in a fictional small town in northern New Mexico, and it centers on the relationship between a 33-year-old man, Amadeo Padilla, and his teenage daughter, and that the father-daughter relationship is sort of the spine of the story. But I think all you need to know at this point is that Angel, the daughter, is pregnant. She's about to give birth any moment. And Amadeo is a member of a lay community of Catholic penitentes, which means that some of the rituals involve physical penance. And Angel watched her father asked to be actually nailed to the cross on Good Friday, and she was really mad about it. So I'm going to read just a brief section from Angel's point of view, and this takes place at Smart Starts, which is the teen parent program she attends with other young mothers and pregnant soon-to-be mothers. Angel pinches the underside of her chin as she thinks. It's journaling time, and Brianna has told them to make a list of the things they each need to make their own and their babies' lives better. The first few are easy. 1, GED or high school diploma and college degree. 2, a support system. 3, a car. 4, a driver's license. 5, a job. Here, Angel is stumped. If she got a job, who would take care of the baby? So she adds 6, free babysitter, a good one. But there is no such thing, not really, not unless your mom or grandma doesn't work. Even Angel knows that. Briefly, she considers her father, then dismisses the thought. Christy and Trinity are whispering. They are best friends and knew each other from before Smart Starts. We got pregnant like the same month, they're always telling people, which is either a crazy fluke or an organizational feat. Both possibilities depress Angel. Who'd like to share, asks Brianna. Today she wears her clunky sandals and a shapeless maroon sweater dress that is too heavy for outside. Jen raises her hand, tucking her silky, mousy hair behind her large white ear, preparing herself for the stage. An education. Jen smiles, anticipating Brianna's praise. Right, draws Lizette. Education. I forgot that one. Angel grins and tries to telegraph her approval to Lizette, but Lizette's beautiful green eyes are half closed like a lizard's. On her left hand, Jen wears a promise ring with a dinky little amethyst. It's my birthstone, she said, as if none of the rest of them were born in months with birthstones. She is going to marry her boyfriend, Jared, whom she met at church and who picks her up every afternoon when Smart Starts lets out. Angel's stomach churns whenever she thinks of her own child's father, Ryan Johnson, the way, in geometry, he always sat in the front row, grimacing up at the board. He always raised his hand to answer questions, but was only correct about 50% of the time. It seemed crazy to Angel to keep putting yourself out there like that. But the next time Mrs. Esposito asked a question, there he was, long, skinny arms swinging in the air. Hey, he told her breathlessly once in the hall after class. I thought of a name for you, a math name. For weeks he called her Angle, or sometimes, delighting himself still further, Obtuse Angle. He was so persistent she felt embarrassed for him, which, along with the tequila shots, explains why she slept with him. Her embarrassment also explains, perhaps, why she hasn't told him the baby is his. So I'll stop there.
Thanks for that. That really is a great capture. I mean, any several pages of this book would be a great capture of your ability to just view the nuances and capture the nuances of people's interactions and their yearnings. That's one of the things I loved about this, is how much the characters want, and that's a great scene. So I narrowed down my questions. I had so many questions reading this book, both as a reader and as a writer. But one of them I'm sure you've had to field a lot, which is that The Five Wounds was originally a short story, and an amazing short story focused mostly on the point of view of Amadeo, the father of Angel, and not so much on Angel or the extended family. And so I'm wondering about, what were some of the discoveries or joys or challenges that you had in trying to break open a short story into a full-length novel?
I mean, I love that you use that that phrase, to break open, because I never intended to extend the story into a novel. It had been out for 2 years before I realized that I was working on a bunch of stories that were engaged with essentially the same cast of characters. They all had different names, but I was sort of stunned to realize that there was something about that dynamic that was so compelling to me. The sort of codependent relationship between, a mother who supports her adult son and his estranged daughter. So at that point, I thought, oh gosh, this is Amadeo and Angel and Yolanda, and I thought maybe I'm working on a novel here. But it wasn't until I could break the story apart, that I was able to make the pages work. I mean, I'd started writing, and it was so fun to be in other people's perspectives. As you point out in the story, I mean, Angel's a secondary character. We only see her through her father's eyes. And it was so much fun to be in her perspective and get to know her and to discover, I mean, all kinds of things. I was sort of thrilled and delighted when she fell in love with Lizette at the teen parent program. But yeah, the story, because it had been out and it was in my first collection, it had a kind of permanence that I needed, that really held me back for a long time. It felt like there was this sort of, ballast at the beginning of the novel, and that I still had to deal with. But then I was finally able to break it open and get rid of things that I didn't need.
You know, I was just cutting those first few chapters apart, like working from the story to the novel as a short story writer, and figuring out, like, what is she doing here? How does she pull this together? How you did it is brilliant. And I did have a suspicion about Amadeo. Sometimes I encounter a character in other people's writing, and sometimes in my own, that's so visceral, that seems so much of the flesh, that I wonder, is this, so how did Amadeo come to you? Like, did he arrive as a full person, or was he somebody you discovered bit by bit?
You know, I think it's always, all of my characters, it always feels like I'm discovering them bit by bit. And I remember, actually, I was sitting in the archaeology library at the University of Arizona when I started this story. And I remember writing I think the first or second paragraph with physical description of him. And he became like clearer and clearer with each line. And then, of course, you know, it takes me a long time to get to know the characters. I mean, I know, I think it sounds goofy sometimes when writers talk about our characters as real people, but that is how it feels to me. And it feels like, you know, as the writer, I have to be with them for a long time, and, you know, see them in different situations, and get to know them the way I would a person, you know, in my life.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I definitely have that feeling of them becoming people. And I actually have now, with some distance from some of my earlier work, begin to miss people. Like, oh, they don't come by anymore. Like, what is that? We all do sound a little bit off our rocker when we start talking like that.
Do you revisit those characters you miss?
Only by rereading passages or going back to things I've said in interviews or things like that.
But you don't,
and sometimes
write them.
No. It's like they told me what they wanted me to know or something, you know? So that part of our relationship is over.
Just the photos remain.
Yeah. The movie ticket stubs, all that. Something else about this, besides that sort of like writer fascination I had with how do you do the work of taking a short story and just busting it to pieces so that you can make a novel out of it. The second thing that really hit me so hard in this book was the way that you have captured a working class family. I feel like a lot of US literature bypasses the people who are powering the country, the people who are doing the day-to-day work. And there's a certain, I don't know, suburban middle-class ethic that is attractive to a lot of publishing houses or whatever. But there's so many of us who come from working class backgrounds, who are working class, who really want to see ourselves reflected on the page. And your depictions of Amadeo and Angel and their family was just like, I could put names from my own family on your characters. I think about some things like all the minor tragedies of working class economic insecurity. So at one point, someone observes that a micro suede couch that they had purchased that looked so good and was also inexpensive was starting to show its wear after a surprisingly short time. Like that sort of like aspiration to beauty that is not available because, you know, of the limited finances. Another one was just the sort of through line of the story is Amadeo pursuing this windshield repair business that he encountered on an infomercial, and just that sort of like, you've just gotten to the guts of working class yearning, of striving, and all the systems that are arrayed against those aspirations, you know? So I was just like, oh my gosh, that's my aunt, that's my sister, that's my, you know, it just broke me so much reading this. So thank you for writing a brilliant working class family novel. So it made me wonder, is that part of your origin? Is that where you come from? And did you encounter any struggles getting attention for your manuscript because you were writing about working class themes?
No, I don't think. No, I didn't. I mean, the novel. I mean, in a lot of ways was. I sold the novel with the collection, so in that way, it they'd already bought it, so they got what they got, and regardless of what was in it. But yeah, I mean those kinds of struggles and differences within the family. I mean, I'm always interested when within a single family there are many different socioeconomic classes, different people have different access to education and to sort of the wider world, and that's certainly true with my family. And I think you know, my family probably recognizes a lot of us in the book. And you know, I've always felt very, very aware that this incredibly uncertain path that I've chosen, of being a writer, is a privilege that nobody else, you know, in previous generations had. My mother was the first in her family to graduate from college, and you know, and she, yeah, I think, you know, she may have liked to take this path, and it wasn't open to her as you know, first generation student. So I'm really interested in that. You know, Valerie in the novel Amadeo's Sister is a professional. She's a counselor in the Albuquerque public school system, and she has studied and worked really hard to get out of the small town where she grew up, and she's still drawn back to it, but she's also exasperated by it. And you know, she judges her brother and her mother, and also loves them, and so there's that kind of push-pull.
Yeah, the tension between Valerie and Amadeo is also brilliantly rendered. And there's a lot of family interaction and relationship building that you show us. And I was just wondering, Valerie and Amadeo being one particularly powerful tension, but there's a lot in the family. Where did your alertness to that sort of dynamic come from?
The brother-sister dynamic?
The brother-sister dynamic, or any of those, like, I wish I could read the whole book to people right now so I could give them a million examples, but just all of those, like, people who live in the same house, people who are, you know, related by blood, all those tensions. Like, where did that alertness come from, do you think?
I grew up really close to my grandparents, and I'm the oldest grandchild, but I sort of feel like I straddle the generations a little bit, because my uncle, my youngest uncle, was a kid when I was born, and you know, and so we were kids in my grandparents' house together, and I think you know, so I was the youngest for a long time and the only grandchild for 5 years, and I was always around people who were older than me. My great grandmother used to take care of me when I was a child, and she lived in this sort of subsidized high rise in Albuquerque, and it was just filled with a lot of old women, and it was a dream for me because she would go from apartment to apartment and visit her friends, and I would just get to listen and play and eavesdrop. And so I was a big eavesdropper, and I was really good at being invisible, or pretending to be absorbed in a game or a book, and fading away and just listening.
Me too. I was legendary. The fake sleeping it's key. The fake sleep, when you perfected that,
the fake
people
sleeping
will say anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think.
And even lingering, I mean, there was a seat at my grandmother's dining room table, and the dining room was sort of off to the side, and if you sit there, you can hear everything in the house and nobody sees you. So
That's so great. I also am the aunt of a nephew who's only a few years younger than me, because my oldest sister is 13 years older than me. So we have that same sort of almost brotherly, sisterly kind of age connection. So yeah, I feel that. We have a question from the audience. It says, are your characters informed by your own life history? We've touched on that a little bit, but I don't know if there's more that you want to say.
Yeah, I mean, the official answer is no. Everybody is totally fictional, and it's all made up. But of course, I mean, there's so much of me, and my family, and some family dynamics in the novel. But I mean, that's not to everybody's in the novel is fictionalized. Like I think members of my family could recognize traits, or a few life choices, or but it is all fiction. And it's something that I think the sort of fictionalizing habit is so deeply ingrained in me that when I sit down to write an essay, I have to catch myself. Like, I'll start just embroidering and fictionalizing, and I have to be very stern, because it's as soon as I start writing about something, I'm adding to it, or subtracting, or reshaping, or making it more interesting to myself.
That's amazing. Yeah, I sometimes tell people, like, don't be my friend if you don't want me picking at your life. Like, I'm not going to criticize you. I'm just going to write about some fictionalized version of you. So
we're kind of scary.
We're a little bit scary, but
do you have rules?
I haven't encountered one yet. So,
okay.
I guess kids, around kids, telling kids stories, I'm probably a lot more careful to combine stories or heavily fictionalize things. But I don't know. I think it's one of the risks and maybe joys of being a friend of a writer, maybe, I hope. I have found myself in my writing group, in my friends' work. So
you have?
Yeah. Something I've said, or,
anything really piercing that you feel just
no, not yet. We'll see.
To the light.
If they're listening right now, maybe they'll take that as a challenge for next month. We'll see.
Yeah, I saw I never think I'm pronouncing his name correctly. The poet Czesław Miłosz give a reading and conversation, and he said, when a writer is born to a family, the family is finished. Which I like. I try to be careful with my family, and I do run things by, if things are close to real life, I run it by my mother, or anybody who I think will see it and might care. And nonfiction, I run it by the people.
That's good of you.
People are sad that they never show up in it. In my work.
I do have to say, there have been a couple of people who I saved for years, like for the right purpose. And they're not people I was close to or not people who are friends, but like people often ask, is anybody in my short story collection a real person? And I would tell them that the villain is actually this substitute teacher from high school who I absolutely despised. And, 30 years later, I get my revenge. So that's, I don't feel bad about that.
Yeah, story in my collection, I started as revenge because it was a woman rear-ended me in the Whole Foods parking lot in Santa Fe. And I was so mad at her.
Oh, yeah.
But the problem with revenge stories is it never turns out that way, because the second you start writing about somebody, if you're doing what our job is to do, then soon those characters become just so close, and it's hard to really get revenge through writing. I think if you are like trying to give everybody, let everybody be fully human and complex.
Yeah, there's definitely an empathy that evolves. With some characters, I feel like I actually have to consciously cultivate that empathy, like with this substitute teacher. But it's kind of a side effect. I think if you're writing fiction that is really trying to get to the heart of how people tick, mm-hmm. you're eventually going to hit some vein of empathy that you can't resist. So
I have to say, Amadeo was a hard character for me to write, because when I started, I was judging him, and I wanted him. I thought it was wrong that he'd not been there for his daughter. I thought, he wasn't trying, and he was, had behaved badly, and I wanted him to be punished in my story. And that got in the way of the story. It was not good for a long time, because I was up here judging him instead of like actually, embodying him. And it was when I realized that, and then I had to, like, actually, as you say, consciously set aside those judgments and try to feel exactly what he would be feeling, that I could make progress with him. But it was like it was an empathetic limitation for a long time, which translated into a craft limitation.
Isn't that the truth? I mean, that happens so often, is that emotional disconnect or over-intellectualization is very often the source of my craft problems. Alejandro Zamora Jr. asks, he says, very excited to be here with you, Jennifer and Kirstin. Thank you. Can you describe a bit of your path to being an author, and who inspires you in your writing?
I think my path, in a lot of ways, I'm very, very typical of other writers. I read a lot when I was a kid. We moved a lot when I was a child. My mother married my dad, and he's a geologist, and we traveled a lot for his research. And so we spent a lot of time living in tents and out of our Volkswagen van, and we were constantly on the road, and mostly in the various deserts of the Southwest. So I spent that time reading and reading and reading. And every time we passed through a town, or I was always imagining what it would be like to live there, to have roots there. So I think that is really the source, that I just was so steeped in stories and always imagining, because I was an outsider and the new kid, I was always, imagining other existences and really watching people, because when you're the new kid constantly, you have to watch if you have any hope of getting a foothold in a new community. So I think that, and I think because we moved so much, I missed home. I missed New Mexico and this sense of being connected to this, big extended family. And I longed for that. And I think that, almost all of my fiction, not all of it, but almost all of it is set in New Mexico.
We have another question from the audience. This one is anonymous. How do you know when your novel is finished?
That is a really good question. I worked on this novel for a long time. The short story was published in 2009, and I started extending it into a novel 2 years later. So it's been a long time, almost a decade living with these characters. It's, in the end, it came down to the deadline, really. I was supposed to deliver it, and so I just had to do those last revisions before the deadline. I was pretty sure I'd missed earlier deadlines, and my editor wasn't, never even checked in on me. I think she trusted that I was working on it. But yeah, once I sent her the draft that I thought was as complete as I could make it at that point, and I knew there would be major changes after that, and that she would have comments. And yeah, so at that point, then things started getting on a schedule, and I had to make those changes. When I read it, I still see words I would cut. But I read it out loud to myself, I think 3 times, I have to read out loud to know what to cut, and to just hear the language. It actually has to hit my ear. And when I can't speak a sentence, if the breath is wrong in the sentence, then I know that the sentence is bad and needs help.
Yeah, that was a huge gift when someone pointed out to me that reading aloud is a great revision process, which interestingly, I started out as a poet. I always identified as a poet from child on, and had a lot of practice reading aloud as a way of editing. But when I switched over to prose, to fiction, for some reason that went out the window. I was like, oh, there's a block of text. You don't read it out loud. And when somebody said, some teacher in grad school said, no, read your work aloud, it brought me right back to that ability to hear the poetic in the prose line, and how important that can be in sort of guiding the reader through a page, even if the page is a block of text instead of a nice little skinny line,
Absolutely. And you can hear, especially for scenes with dialogue, you can hear when the dialogue is unnatural and needs attention. That's one of I always give my students revision exercises, and some are optional and some are required, but I think only 2 are required, but that one is required. They have to read it out loud. And I think it's even better if you can read it out loud to like another human, and preferably someone who you want to think really well of you, like a frenemy or an ex, like that. So it can be helpful to just imagine the ex sitting there, her arms crossed, like.
So let's see what we have. I don't see very well, so I have to crank this up to like 500 points. Mary Smith says, such an interesting conversation. I am so anxious to read the book. My question for Kirstin is, What is your writing routine? Do you write regularly, and is it difficult with your teaching schedule?
So I always feel like I want to lie when I get asked this question. Um, when things are going well, um, it's because I'm writing regularly every day, and that's when I'm happiest and when the work is better. And because I find, when I don't write for, even a couple days, um, I'm no longer in the stream, and it takes time to enter. I think of it as like entering an actual river. It's hard to get in. It's cold, and you don't really want to get wet, maybe. But once you're in it, you can really swim. And then you get out, and the sun warms you, and then it's hard to get back in. So it's best when I'm doing it every day. And with the teaching, one of the nice things about teaching is that I get breaks. So really, it's the winter break, Thanksgiving break, summer. That's when the bulk of my writing happens. But it's often during the semester, my writing time will be spent either working on shorter projects or essays, or doing editing and that kind of thing, because that stuff can more easily fit into a teaching schedule.
Which raises the question, do you have multiple projects going at once?
Yes, I do. It's the thing that keeps me from despair, because when things feel difficult with one project, then I can switch over. And but usually I'm working on one thing for a while. But I like knowing that there are other pots simmering away. How about you? Do you?
Yes, that's totally me. Like, I'm pretty devoted to one project at a time, but I need to know that there are other things that I can escape to. And I do sometimes escape to for a brief time. So it's better if that thing is like shorter, or maybe less, maybe somehow I'm less invested in it, so that it's kind of like a little bit of a vacation, but I'm still working. I'm still keeping that muscle going. I'm still in the process of moving house. And so my writing practice has been entirely disrupted. And there was a moment where I was carrying a box into the house, and I just said, I just want my stories. Like, writing is a refuge, and even though it's hard to get in that cold water, I still feel like overall it is a refreshment to me. And so it feels like I've been away from it now for almost 3 weeks, this whole move. And it's been like, I'm starting to get really thirsty for that water, So
I think, though, that there's something really valuable about that too, about the longing for it. Because then when finally your desk is set up and you have your books unpacked, it will feel so good. And I think that kind of energy can propel. I mean, I know, like, during very busy teaching semesters when I'm just so harried, often the writing right after that, when I finally get a couple days, is some of the most satisfying, and I make the most progress.
That's so interesting. I remember somebody telling me, think about your writing, like if you are experiencing writer's block, take your writing on a date, and like think about it like, oh, you need to like get dressed up for this person. You need to like be your best self and show up to this thing, this date. And, really like think of it as a partner you're trying to woo, or something along those lines. I'm being very clumsy with this analogy. But in that same sense, what I'm feeling right now is a little bit like missing somebody I love, like, oh, I can hardly wait. Maybe tomorrow I get to see them again.
Yeah. I like that. I feel like so often, I get to my writing, and, I've just gotten up and my hair's in a messy ponytail and my contacts are still sort of askew in my eye. The writing's not getting my best self sometimes.
Can't see you. Two of our audience members have asked something along the lines of, who are your favorite authors, or what authors inspire you?
You know, I always freeze up at that question, which is silly because there's so many. I love Alice Munro. I mean, I think she's probably the writer I go back to the most, and her stories are just endlessly interesting, and the more times I read it, the more they open up. And the thing that she does that's so miraculous is that, you know, over the course of a story, so it's like, what, 20 pages maybe, she's constantly peeling away layers of these characters. And just when you think you know them and you know everything about them and you've gotten to the deepest possible layer, then she flips that again. There's all of these wonderful inversions and surprises, and her characters are just infinitely complicated, like real people, and that I admire so much, and it makes it, you know, she's such a joy to read and to study. I do sometimes think she, you know, with any of the writers I love so much, it's sometimes there is just this magic, and, you know, so I can read and read and read, and to an extent I can see what she's doing and, you know, try to replicate that. But there's also just a magic there that's all hers.
I love her too. Liam Callanan, Milwaukee novelist, short story writer. He asks, how do you deal with the voices on your shoulder, imaginary critics? And he also simply says hi.
It's so good to see your name, Liam. I hope I can see you in person someday soon. I think for me, writing is, I mean, to be honest, I'm a fearful writer. You know, I'm always, it takes me, I mean, the first hour, 45 minutes, I'm just worried about the writing, that I'm not going to be able to get into it, that I'm not going to get to know the characters, that the characters, everything's bad. And that's when the imaginary critic really comes out. And it's better now because I know that the first 45 minutes are always going to be hard, and I just power through it. And then once I'm through it, then I'm in it. But I feel like I'm constantly tricking myself. So I say, you know, this revision is just for fun. I'm going to practice cutting things, and it doesn't matter because I've saved the original document. And so this one doesn't matter. I'm just playing around. Or I'll do that with a new story that I'm working on. Like, nobody will see this. This one's not to go anywhere. This is just for me to have fun with. And so I'm constantly telling myself that, and you know, oh, whatever I do today, if it's terrible, then I can go back to the version I had yesterday and move on from there. I almost have never cut. That's not true. Very, very, very rarely, I'll cut something and then decide I need something that I cut, and usually it's like one line from that. It's but it's telling myself that helps me to take the risks I need to take.
Yeah, one of the most liberating things that I experienced was I help administer a writing center here in rural Wisconsin called the Driftless Writing Center. And one of the co-founders of the center led a workshop once. Her name is Lisa Henner. She brought her paper shredder to the workshop and said, you can put your writing that we do tonight in the shredder the minute your pen leaves the page. And so I did that. And I was like, I've never had to do it again, but just the feeling of like, I can take or leave this, or, you know, I'll get it back if I need it. It was just so liberating. It gave me this sense of insurance almost that got me over some of that like hypersensitivity to my own potential for failure, you know?
Yeah, it's awful. I mean, that fear, that perfectionism is, I would say that's the biggest dragon that I have to battle. That I love that though, that idea of the paper shredder, because yeah.
You can have a mental, like an imaginary paper shredder in your head. We have another question, one that I love. Can you talk about writing place, especially a place like New Mexico that has a history that isn't always known and has so much baggage? You captured the texture, rhythms, heart, and humor of New Mexico so well without the romanticism that often plagues New Mexico. It made me homesick and I loved it, says Lisa. I'm going to murder your last name. I'm sorry, Bowdwin.
It's nice to see a fellow New Mexican. You know, I think the complicated history of New Mexico, it is a place that land has been, I mean, people love it. I mean, there's a reason that so much art has been has been created out of that landscape, and there's a reason tourists love to come. There's a reason Ansel Adams and Willa Cather and D.H. Lawrence and George O'Keeffe went to New Mexico. It's beautiful, but the result, as you say, is that it is so heavily romanticized, and you know, it does it to itself. Santa Fe, you know, all of the building regulations, and in the 1920s there was a very concerted choice to make it into, you know, to preserve the history and to turn it into this tourist place. But you know that it is a land that, you know, there's been conquest after conquest. I mean, the Spanish, you know, my ancestors had an incredibly brutal, bloody colonization of the place, and you know, Native Americans were pushed off the land and then fought back. You know, it's constant back and forth. Then the U.S. government, I mean, there was the Spanish-American War, and then, you know, eventually it passed into the hands of the United States, and the U.S. government was another conquest. And then there's, you know, I would say that there's sort of an economic conquest with, you know, a lot of money pouring in. There's such economic disparity there. And that conflict and those old hurts are so present in the moment. Like, you feel it. I mean, I don't think I need to tell you, Lisa, because you're from there, but all of those injuries are alive today. You feel them. And I think that's why it's just endlessly fascinating to me. I want to understand this place that I love and that is home, and that also confounds me.
That leads into another question that came up for me while I was reading the book. And it's sort of I don't know how you would characterize it. So let me give you the concept and you can reframe it however you want, but sort of the ethnic ambiguity or ethnic ambivalence of the characters. For example, Amadeo is asked to say some prayers in Spanish, and he's like, don't really, not super comfortable with Spanish, you know? So I've been thinking a lot about this as somebody who's second generation Mexican-American, of like being really part of the culture and not, and then part of the bigger culture. And I feel, again, with your characters, I had so much resonance of being like, of living in this sort of middle space that is not, you know, full on Mexican American and not Anglo, you know? So I wonder if you have any thoughts about what your characters might be exploring for you, or what they might be commenting on about that sort of ambiguity of neither place.
Well, I think they're, I mean, the Padilla family are all Latino, and you know they would be really mestizo, because the you know, everyone there, you know, 400 years in the same place. There's intermarriage, but there is, I mean, when I was growing up, the label I heard was Hispanic, and which I mean, I have a lot to say about that, but I think that that's a problematic term. I think it's a word that erases a lot of the you know, native ancestors who were in the bloodline, and that erasure goes back centuries, and the sort of uneasiness with Spanish goes back generations. My great grandmother had a store in the very, very tiny town where my grandmother grew up, and she could read in English because she had gone to boarding school for 2 years in Albuquerque. And so she translated for a lot of her neighbors. She would, you know, write letters for them. And that was a source of power and access that my great grandmother had. And there, you know, my grandparents were hit in school for speaking Spanish. And when they moved to Santa Fe, and had kids, it was the 50s and 60s. There was a lot of anxiety about assimilation. And my mother remembers, she was also a bit of a spy. She remembers overhearing some adults talking, and I think it was the Moyas, and they were saying that they were over for cocktails, and they were saying that they were going to go by Morris. They were going to anglicize their names. And you know, so there was in the 50s and 60s a lot of anxiety. My grandparents didn't speak Spanish to their kids, and you know, so we have a little bit of home Spanish that we pick up, and I grew up hearing it, but only among the oldest generations. My grandmother would speak Spanish to her mother, you know, and if we feel a tremendous loss, all of us wish that we'd grown up with that, but they really were doing what they thought was the best for their kids, and there was so much racism and shame, and you know, they were trying to give their kids opportunities. So I think there is a lot of, I mean, I don't think there is a lot of internalized white supremacy, and you know, this I have you know, some distant cousins who identify as Spanish, which I think is absurd because they are not. I mean, or if they are, you know, it was 400 years ago, and again, it's all about erasure, and it's a fraught thing.
It is. And I appreciate all that you just said about it. It's tough. I mean, it's stuff that we choose in some way, or that our characters might choose, but they're choosing it in the context of hundreds of years of history and systems and institutions demanding certain things. Like my grandfather, who came from Mexico, his mom was indigenous, but he would tell me all the time, I am Spanish, I am white, because in Mexico, you know, there was a whole institution of racial hierarchy where you had to be this much white, this much Spanish to be able to hold certain jobs. And, you know, the whole society was stratified by your origin. So, you know, he was kind of adopting this like practiced Spanishness as a way to get away from the pain, the harm of that system, you know. So it's so complicated. And every time I read a book that maybe can offer some insight, I am so grateful. So
yeah, it's a really, I had something else I was going to say about that. Oh, you know, I grew up and my grandparents were self-conscious about their accents and their grammar. And, you know, and then after college, I was living in Bolivia and my grandparents came to visit and we went out to lunch and they spoke Spanish to the waiter and the waiter couldn't understand them. And, you know, this is their first language. And it was the language that really was fraught for them. It was so heartbreaking because they also speak just a very, very regional version. It's an archaic version that has been preserved in, you know, these small communities in northern New Mexico. So, you know, the Spanish I learned in school is not the Spanish that they grew up speaking. So there are all these different layers to it. I think also, you know, in northern New Mexico that I think one of the reasons that my characters don't reflect as much on their racial identity is that they just are. Like everybody around them is Latino. They're, you know, they're just in that soup, and so they don't have to think about it as much, except when it comes up when they can't speak. You know, when Amadeo can't read the Spanish that his great uncle gives him.
Yeah, I just thought, forgive me for using the word ambivalence, but just that the position your characters hold in that racial conversation by not engaging in it was very powerful for me as a person who spends a lot of time thinking about racial and ethnic identity. So thank you. I think we have a really good question to close on, which is from Diane. And she asks, if you were going to choose a book from the shelves behind you to recommend, which one would it be?
That's a good question. There's so many. Do I have to just pick one?
No, you're the boss. You do whatever you want.
They're all so good. There is Ian Lee's book, Where Reasons End, is a stunning, heartbreaking novel. That I recommend that so much. Sabrina and Karina by Kali Fajardo-Anstein is a collection of stories that I just read. That's really wonderful. Jennifer Dubois is one of my favorite writers. I have 3 of her books here. So many people to recommend.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I feel like as both a writer and a reader, this book really fed me. In addition to reading your short stories in Night at the Fiestas, which I highly recommend, especially for people who are curious to see how the 5 Wounds moved from its origins as a short story to this amazing novel. So thank you so much for the conversation and for writing.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. This was really such a gift, and I really appreciate your kind attention and your generosity, and I'm really happy to meet you.
I'm glad to meet you too. Thanks.
We are so glad you both were able to share all your discussion with us. Don't forget, you can buy a copy of The 5 Wounds. Don't forget, you can also purchase Meet Me Halfway. You can talk about the book with Larry Mueller coming up soon. And I just wanted to mention, I'm also Alice Munro.
Oh, look at her.
How about that for a pile? So congratulations on your success. And I'm sure we'll be hearing more about the book for the rest of the year. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who came, because we wouldn't have a bookstore without you. I hope to see you at another event, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Daniel.